Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about rook and pawn endgames, and I'm going to be showing you a method that you need to use to win about 90% of your rook and pawn endgames, if not 95% of your rook and pawn endgames, where you have an advantage. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So the position that we have in front of us right now, this is actually an excerpt from a game between Walter Brown and Arthur Bisguier, which was played in the USA Championship back in 1974. And Arthur Brown had the white pieces, and it was his move, and he's actually got a pretty sizable advantage here. The number of pawns on the board is actually equal. White has 5 pawns, black has 5 pawns, but white has the much more active rook in the position. That rook is actually threatening to take a whole bunch of stuff. That rook is threatening to take on h7 and putting pressure on b7, which we can maybe amplify with the other rook. And also, white has the actual passed pawns, and white has, of course, the cleaner pawn structure. So the one downside in white's position is, of course, white's back rank is weak. So this is something that white's going to need to fix at some point by, playing something like pawn to h4. Now, Walter Brown's technique in this position was absolutely perfect. The way that he played this is the absolute way that you're supposed to play a position like this, using a method that I like to call chuck and run, which is in rook and pawn endgames, it doesn't really matter how many pawns you have. What matters is how far up the board those pawns are, because the value of the pawns in rook and pawn endgames increases so drastically as they move up the board that we're actually willing to sacrifice pawns just to get our pawn to move one additional square. And Walter Brown just shows this technique with absolute perfection in this position. So his first move was actually really good. He plays rook b1, and he's threatening to go active with both rooks. He's threatening to take on the 7th. He's threatening to take on b7. So then Arthur Bisguier plays bishop rook to g5, trying to save his position, and Walter Brown makes a Luft move with tempo. Walter Brown plays pawn to h4. He doesn't want to get into trouble. He knows he's got a great position. He knows he's got it in the bag. He just doesn't want to blow it. So he makes sure that his king's got a Luft square on the h2 square that he can run to, and he's doing this with tempo. So Bisguier plays rook b5. There's not much else. Otherwise, both rooks are going to end up on the 7th rank, and every single pawn in black's camp will get gobbled up. So these rooks get exchanged, and now we're in a 2-rook endgame, and now we have rook h7. So now here's the approach. This h-pawn is already very far up the board. Walter Brown just wants to get it further up the board, and if in doing that he sacrifices a couple of pawns, he really doesn't care. I call this method the chuck and run approach. We chuck a whole bunch of pawns that we don't care about, and we just run with the one that's the furthest up the board. So we have rook check, king h2, rook d2. So does Walter Brown try to coddle his pawns and save them? He could certainly do it. He could play a move like king g3. He could play pawn f3 or even pawn f4. He just doesn't care. If you want to take the f-pawn, if you want to take the a-pawn, that's fine. The h-pawn is the one that's the furthest up the board right now. So he just takes on h6. He gives the h-pawn a buddy. Now the g-pawn is also passed. We have rook a2, and he just chucks that h-pawn up the board, sacrificing the pawn on f2, not spending 1 second to even try to defend the f2 pawn. Brown goes ahead and Bisguier goes ahead and takes it. Brown goes ahead and plays rook h8. So this is another thing that you'll see with the chuck and run strategy. And it's another thing that you'll see in a lot of rook and pawn endgames that I see amateurs really kind of make mistakes with, is they're aware of usually like 1 or 2 general principles of rook and pawn endgames. One of them that I hear all the time is rooks belong behind passed pawns. And that's certainly true. If this rook was already behind the passed pawn, this game would already be over. Black could just resign on the spot. We would just play h6, h7. This rook would have to actually, the rook would actually have to go back and try to stop that pawn from queening, and then we could just chuck the g-pawn down the board and the game would be over. The problem is we're 3 tempos away from getting that rook behind the pawn. If you spend time to play rook g6, rook g4, rook h4 here, you will go from a position where you're winning to a position where you're either lost or just the position is completely equal and you've given up your entire advantage. You cannot afford to waste 3 tempo in a rook and pawn endgame. It is just much more important to get this rook further up the board. That's why oftentimes with strong players you'll see these scenarios where the rooks end up in front of the pawns, and they leave them there because it's just more important to throw that pawn up the board as quickly as possible, because that is the more important principle to follow. So we have rook h8, king c7, h6, throwing that pawn up the board, and then we have king b6. Now here we have interesting technique from Walter Brown, and just absolutely correct technique. Whenever you're pushing an h-pawn up the board, you want to kind of stop right at the 6th rank, and you don't push it all the way to the 7th. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but specifically with h-pawns, there's some really big reasons for it. Number one, you need a place to potentially hide your king. And h7 is really the only square left. Whenever you have the rook in front of the h-pawn, you need a place to hide your king. And so you push it most of the way, but not all the way, so that you have that square to hide your king. So now the easiest method to win is just to chuck the other pawn up the board. And it's just an easy win. You're just going to push the g-pawn up the board, and that's going to be that. And that's exactly what Brown does. He starts chucking that other pawn up the board. He doesn't really care that much about what's going on the other side of the board. And once that pawn gets to g5, it's pretty much a wrap. He's going to be tempoing all the rest of the way down. There's really no way to defend this. Now the h-pawn is definitely going to make a queen. All the king has to do is just approach the rook, and eventually the rook will be forced to sacrifice itself for the pawn, which it did. And once that happened, Arthur Biscayr finally threw in the towel and said that's a wrap. At this point, the king and the rook will be able to corral the remaining b-pawn. It's not far enough up the board with king support to where white actually has to sacrifice for it. White can simply go over there and win it. So what happens if we don't use the chuck and run approach? Well, if we don't use the chuck and run approach, we can get into some trouble. Now, interestingly enough, one of the greatest players of all time, Robert James Fischer, had some difficulties with this in his early career. In Fischer's early career, he actually got into trouble twice. He got into trouble once in his game in Bled in 1961 against Peter Trifunik. And we're going to take a look at that game starting from the critical position. Now, right here, Black had just played king f5, and White had to choose between one of two moves. He had to choose between king to c4, and he had to choose between f3. Now, Bobby Fischer, in his youth, when he was still coming up as a player, back in 1961, he wasn't the same player that he was in 1972 when he won the World Championship, and he was just absolutely dominant and just played all these positions perfectly. Fischer had this choice between king c4 and f3, and he was very materialistic when he was a much younger player, and it almost cost him a lot more games than it did, but it did actually cost him a few games. Now here he has to choose between these two moves, and he chose the incredibly materialistic move pawn to f3. And this is the same mistake I see a lot of inexperienced endgame players make. He plays this move to basically keep the black king out of his king side. But the reality is, the easier method is he just shouldn't care. He should just take on c4 and let the king in. Let the king come to g4 and then simply play king b3 with tempo and then just chuck that pawn up the board. He could lose every single pawn on the king side and it shouldn't make any difference to him at all. And this doggedness in this game almost cost him the full point. He managed to win the game anyway. After pawn to f3, we had pawn to c3, which was a very good move, made the position a lot more complicated, and then he continued to play kind of questionable moves just to safeguard the material. He played rook f2, and again, he should have just ripped the pawn and ran. King c3, rook a3 check, give up the pawn on f3. You don't care about it. He was coddling that pawn with rook f2. He could have just got out of the way and just run with the c-pawn, and that's a totally winning position, and there's not going to be any problems. Now, in this case, he still managed to eventually win the game after rook f2. His position was strong enough that he still managed to win, and he eventually stumbled on the right strategy, but it was touch and go, like he almost lost this game. But if we take a look at another game, he was not so lucky. He was actually playing a game against Mikhail Botvinnik in 1962, and he basically did the same type of thing. Now, if we cut to the critical point in this position, we'll see that Fischer here has a choice between rook e7 and pawn to a5. Fischer's got a great position. He's got the black pieces here. Mikhail Botvinnik is white. Fischer's got black. And Fischer's got a great position with black. He's up a pawn. He has the more active rook. He has the potential passed pawn on the queen side. So what's the correct method here? Well, the correct method is to chuck and run. The correct method is to get those queenside pawns up the board as quickly as possible. So the absolute right move, without a doubt, is just to chuck, just to play pawn to a5 and start chucking this pawn up the board. And of course, the analysis that was given by Botvinnik was just rook b3, rook b4, and Botvinnik points out this king and pawn endgame is completely winning if the rooks get exchanged. After rook b4, a captures b4, the king and pawn endgame is winning. Now, of course, it is possible that Fischer was afraid that it was going to remain a rook and pawn endgame, but again, he's got the more active rook, and he's got the pawns further up the board. So after something like, say, h4 check, king f5, rook f3 check, we would have king e6, rook e3 check, king d6, rook back to e2, and now white is in a defensive posture, we would have something like rook b5, f4, rook d5, just getting out of the way, and then we would start chucking and running. You know, rook a2, king e6. We would give up that pawn on b6 because we don't care. Go ahead, take the pawn on b6. We're going to chuck that a pawn as far up the board as possible and obtain a winning position. That's the correct method. So after rook b4, we would eventually take and give up the b pawn. That's the critical idea here. This would be the totally appropriate method according to Stockfish. So then you get out of the way and you start chucking that pawn up the board, and eventually you combine pushing the pawn forward with mate threats, and this would be completely winning. There is not going to be a way to defend. In the long term, eventually that pawn is going to get far enough down the board, we just can't defend the position anymore, and then something like this would happen, and eventually the game would be over because eventually we can exchange and push our h-pawn, and that's a wrap. We would chuck and run. So if we'd get the a-pawn all the way down the board, and then we'd chuck the a-pawn, and we'd run with the h-pawn. And that's the appropriate method. So what is the consequence of him, defending passively? Like, in this case, he actually ended up getting a draw because Botvinnik was able to go active. So if we go back to this critical situation after rook a3, he plays rook e7, to try to safeguard everything. He brings that rook back to e7, and then we're going to have rook back to f3, rook c7, a4, rook c5, rook goes to the 7th rank, so now white's getting really, really active, and this was the huge downside, as white was able to go active, and then black ended up not having enough in this position to win it. Botvinnik was actually able to hold the draw. Black didn't get his pawns far enough down the board to make a difference, and he ended up with two very non-ideal passed pawns versus a slightly more ideal passed pawn. But actually, even Botvinnik pointed out, he said, even without the f-pawn, this position should still be a draw, which is why rook pawns are some of the worst passers that you can have in rook and pawn endgames. These two rook pawns were just not going to be enough to win, and this game actually ended in a draw. So that's the method, and that's how we use it. I call it the chuck and run method. You chuck some of your pawns and you run with the ones that are further up the board, and that's going to win you most of your games 90% of the time in your rook and pawn endgames. This is how it's done. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.